Well, up next, we have a man who I've had the honour of working alongside at SBS for a number of years, the remarkable Craig Foster. A former Socceroo, a broadcaster, author, and increasingly known for his advocacy for human rights. He joins us today with his social justice voice on why food equity is not an Aboriginal issue, not a minority issue, not a health issue, but it is an issue that's interwoven with so many factors that obscure and perpetuate this most basic human right to food. So please welcome Craig, who's here to elevate the voices and perspectives of those affected to those who have the power and authority to create meaningful change. Craig.
Great, thank you. All right, hi everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about some, I guess, of the broader issues, and particularly cultural and social, which you've heard here in the opening speeches a great deal. Of course, I do acknowledge, like everyone else today, the traditional owners, Bidjigal people of the land here, and respect the elders past, present and future. So it's great to be here, but why ask a former sports person to come and talk about an issue like this? Well, I spend a lot of my time in the same industry that you do. I volunteer actually at a little place over in Marrickville called Addison Road Community Centre. And I went during COVID in particular and saw the rise in need of the same communities coming out, and particularly people coming straight across from Redfern, multicultural communities, so-called, that term, coming, day on day. I saw the students come, the international students who were told that they're no longer of enough value because they're economic units. And so then when COVID hits and they can't go home, they were told, well, sorry, you guys got to look after yourself. And so several hundred of them were coming down. It ended up about 250 every week coming down, not just to get food, but actually to get a haircut, to get legal advice, to try and get support with their visa, with their fees that universities were still charging them throughout that period, and to have people wrapped around them who could actually not just help them, but cared about them. And it was a really good example of what happens in food insecurity or food inequity. And that is that we all know in this room that's actually not about food, it's about people. And a country like Australia can't leave anyone without food. It's not possible unless we choose to. We can't leave anyone without a house unless we're comfortable with that. It's really that simple. I congratulate you on the start today. This is a reasonably small room. How many people do you reckon you have in here? Like about 100 or so, perhaps? Really important representatives who understand the issue really well. If we are going to actually create food equity, we're going to need about 1,000 of these rooms around the country. Because we're talking here about all levels of society, and we heard from the Minister David about the importance of government. Of course, that's very, very true. But at the start, it's going to take people of Australia to say this is no longer acceptable. We're having a lot of conversations in Australia at the moment, actually. Some really important ones right now and only in the next month or so. But particularly coming out off the back of COVID, there's a lot of rethinking of inequities, because what COVID did was brought them all out, or many of them anyway. And we talked at that time about all the people who had fallen through the cracks. And I always thought that was a very odd statement, a very odd term, falling through the cracks. Well, how can that happen? How do we leave cracks? What are the decisions that makes cracks? And when people in COVID started to be able to tell their story about how they'd been or were being left behind, those stories weren't just about the fact that a pandemic had hit and they'd lost their job. It was about the fact that this had been going on for years, decades and more. So Australia, for the first time in a very long time, actually was able to see all these communities and say, well, hang on a minute, where do they come from? And that's because we don't tell the stories. Why is that? Because we tell stories that we care about. So you guys are the experts on systems, on interaction with governments, on all of the different aspects within your particular fields. My field is more broad as to what do we and don't we care about. So it might be interesting just digging into it a little bit so that for your conversations today, you can choose whether you want to be truly courageous. Now, this is the perfect room to do it because you guys are really at the coalface. But we talk a lot about courageous conversations in Australia, don't we? And we are having a lot of conversations this year. But I think we all know that actually really pushing through and really telling the truth and really getting to the heart of matters is actually difficult because there is a cost to doing it. Because you all sit in here and ultimately you're working within a system. And so there is a cost to stepping outside that and really challenging the system. I know, I've done it in a number of areas and I've seen the career cost. I've seen, that we have choices to make every day about how hard and how far we're actually going to push. Volunteering at Addison Road, it very quickly became clear to me that we should be superfluous. So we're filling an increasing hole due to the breaches in the social fabric and choices we make at policy level, and it's an endless bottomless pit. And I wasn't aware, as you are, and I would say to the organisation, well, this is not sustainable. We can't. But there's a lot of organisations, I see this also in the refugee sector and in many others. There's a lot of organisations whose existence is actually predicated on that issue. Right? And so our job actually is to make ourselves superfluous. Would you agree? There's a huge charity industry in this country. It's immense. The real question is, should it exist? And what are we going to do to make sure that it doesn't? And you are the people who are going to have those conversations. What do we value? What do we undervalue? And what do we devalue? Well, this is a fantastic sector to have those conversations. So, a basic human right, as identified by the Attorney General's Department, and all of the instruments to which we are signatories as a country, makes very, very clear. Like, it's explicit. It couldn't be more clear. That everyone has a right to housing and everyone has a right to food. It's that simple. There are no ifs, there are no buts. We are signatories to those conventions, of which there's a number. And this convention, International on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the like, requires countries to take appropriate measures to provide adequate nutritious foods and clean drinking water and to assist parents and others responsible. And it requires countries to guarantee the right of everyone to housing without distinction as to race, colour, national or ethnic origin. Well, that's interesting because that's where it intersects here. And it also, as part of their obligation to protect people's resource base for food, countries should take appropriate steps to ensure that activities of the private business sector are in conformity with the right to food. Is that happening? So how much do we really care? And how much are we really going to challenge today? You are experts on the systemic factors. But how can some be disregarded, left out, forgotten, invisible? We talk about it. We've got terms for it. Those who fell through the cracks and never seem to have these very well documented problems attended to. And I congratulate Aboriginal Affairs on having this a conference today, because First Nations are one of the absolute key. And there are many. And in fact, the Minister rightly mentioned many of them, David, because we all know what they are. Food insecurity is not only economic, political, policy, interagency, resources issue, it's an issue about not caring about certain people in society. And we need to decide whether we care enough. treating people as different and differently. So there must be something, or some things, there must be, by definition, about certain groups in Australia that mean we don't care enough as a country about the fact they can't eat today or tomorrow, or that their children don't have enough food. What is it? Well, it's about exclusion, of which, of course, there are many forms. Aboriginal Affairs knows better than anyone in this country. Understanding Australian government, again, Institute of Family Studies, understanding food insecurity in Australia. My question to you, do we understand it? Okay. We know it exists. We know that we don't really confront it. And your job is to connect the dots as to how we can do that. But we know it's there. Here's what that report said. Some Australians may be more vulnerable, are more vulnerable to food insecurity, including low-income earners, people who are socially or geographically isolated, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, yes. That's 3 ticks. Culturally and linguistically diverse groups, 4 ticks. Single-parent household, 5. Older people, 6. People experiencing homelessness, 7. Now, you could have written all of those 7. So could most Australians, actually, would at least get 4 or 5. But we're not changing it. First, the impoverished, the dole bludgers, so-called. Does Australia care? You all seen Robodebt, right? Okay. So you know how heinous that was. We're coming after you. You won't get away with it. You're stealing money from society. All proven to be untrue, of course, but this is how demonisation works. This is how a society is able to not care. So this has implications for all of us in terms of the public narrative, in terms of our expectations of governments, not just policy, but narrative, approach, respect, the word we use a lot, equality, concepts of unworthiness, lack of merit, leaners not lifters, that's a good one. That worked well. Whoever came up with that one, that was powerful, right? It was effective. That's why they're used, these terms. Disinterest in social, psychological, intergenerational factors, doesn't matter. You're just a bludger. None of this was mentioned in the right to food security. So the human right to have food today didn't have a whole heap of provisos in the United Nations instrument. It doesn't say every human being has a right to food except those who are dole bludgers and who are hiving off society. That's not part of the instrument. We made it up. This doesn't even need my words. Just needs you to think it through, because it all has implications for what you're talking about today. Non-Anglo or non-white communities in Australia. I sit on the Australian Multicultural Council. We are having a really interesting conversation with a multicultural framework review, and multiculturalism in Australia is only 50 years old. In fact, it is exactly 50 years old this year in 2023, as many of you would know. And so now the concept, the term itself is being re-examined, and rightly so. Because 50 years ago in 73 under Whitlam, when Australia said, well, hang on, we've had a white Australia policy, and, so we don't want, a non-white people here, effectively, for a very long period of time, almost 70 years, to varying degrees. That's now stopped, and now we're going to have this kind of adjunct of different migrant groups and cultures and languages and religions come, and that was called multiculturalism. Today, and of course, let's acknowledge the more than 400 multicultures that we had for 65,000 years. Today, multiculturalism is Australia. So over the course of 50 years, now the terminology has to be challenged, because now that is us. That is this room. And so using the term multiculturalism is telling people who've who are or were non-white after White Australia policy. It's telling them that you're still something different here, that we need this policy for you. And whereas now, we are one of the most diverse nations on earth. And so we need to internalise that and think about what that means. How do we centre diversity now? Right? So that actually is us. But power in Australian society still rests very largely with white and particularly male. Have a look in politics and across industry and all of the rest, right? So equality. So the question is, are we really committed to equality? Equality means being absolutely committed to elevating everyone. The lowering of barriers for anyone. Food security is just one, but it's a very important one. And where power rests equally with all of us. That's my definition of diversity, is everyone in Australia is considered and can feel genuinely the same. First Nations people, along with multicultural communities, why it's in parentheses, are called ethnic, diverse, whatever terms it is that we use today or will use, are the subjects of overt, covert and systemic racism in Australia. Okay, I don't think that this room is challenged by that. There are still parts of Australia which are challenged by that and still want to deny, in fact, that racism even exists. So how much do we care for that minority in number? I'm talking about numerous, not in worth. Are not catered for, not heard, not represented, not housed or fed. How much do we actually care as a country? That's the real question. Right? Because policy flows from that. Then the question is, well, how do we make it happen? Which I'm pleased to hear David had said this morning. That's exactly right. How are you guys going to advise us to make it happen? But first we want it. First we have to want it. Okay, that's not terribly challenging, but it's one of the factors to what we're talking about here today. My experience at Addy Road was very similar, and this is where we have to also challenge ourselves. I read a good book a few years ago about, I can't quite remember the title, I'm afraid, but most of you will know or might have read it, about philanthropy and about people whose economic engine that provides intergenerational wealth is predicated on many of these factors and on inequity, and then we transfer our massive amounts of wealth into foundations, and we now decide to do some volunteering and some charity at the same time that the engine is keeping people essentially oppressed. And so this is a very common phenomenon in philanthropy. Is you look at the some of the largest foundations and you say, well, look, you guys are doing an incredible job, but then you realise actually where the money came from. You say you're actually causing this massive problem to the climate or to people here, and now you're essentially washing your image by now doing some good philanthropic work. So, that's another conversation that needs to be had in Australia. So, just quickly, and thank you guys for all your attention. So for First Nations, Australians, we're talking here about assimilation, historic assimilation, which is essentially, a refusal to be white, essentially, and to maintain, the incredible culture under such duress over the last couple hundred years that you heard Shane talk about. And the attribution of blame. So, it's your problem. Our systems that we develop as a country don't really contribute to it. You guys just need to make better choices. That's what you're going to challenge today, and I know you've already done that individually. So why aren't we committed to ensuring that everyone has enough? Well, because we're not committed to equality yet. Would you agree or not? No one can say that we are committed to equality for First Nations in Australia. I don't think that's at all possible, given where we are in terms of life outcomes, and you talked about the gaps, right? And so here is just some of the coverage of some of the issues that minority in number communities face in Australia, and there are many. And by the way, these are very, very recent, right? We don't have to go back too far. concerns and priorities regarding food, a systemic review of qualitative evidence. It's all there. Report on food pricing and food security only 3 years ago in remote Indigenous communities, coming during and on the back of COVID. The work is all there. There are 16 recommendations. This was Julian Lisa, MP, who chaired this only a couple of years ago. It's all there. The recommendations aren't the problem. Making choices is the problem. So how do we, as a movement, you, as a movement in this room, work on the systemic issues, but also understand you need 1,000 of these rooms and you need to challenge these things? Otherwise, we're just filling little holes. Representation of everyone in Australia. Media, politics, industry, academic, civil society. How can we get towards a place where everyone gets to be part of Australia and to be part of telling their stories, and we understand the linkage? At the start and the end, it's about equality, seeing everyone as equal. So all of us need to fight for equality in all its forms. And by the way, here is Charter of Rights, Charter of Human Rights for Australia, and organisations, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, who've been calling for it. When we say across all society that everyone is valued, everyone is equal, there's not going to be any cracks when it comes to food or housing. Just 2 examples. No more cracks. That's the question. How do we make that happen? All right, thank you. I congratulate you on what you're doing, and I wish you a great couple of days. Thank you.